The blood on Viktor Carrera's shirt wasn't his. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, 32 floors above the waterfront, watching the lights of Halifax Harbour ripple across the black water below. Behind him, 2 of his men were quietly rolling something in plastic. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. "Get it out of my building," he said, "and someone find me a dry cleaner who doesn't ask questions." His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. His lawyer, Dominic Firth, had been calling for the past hour. Viktor finally answered. "Tell me it's done," Viktor said. "The Delacroix hearing is in 3 weeks," Dominic said carefully. "The judge they assigned, Cartel, she's clean. Won't be moved. Viktor, the only thing that protects you right now is the image. Family man, community leader. Someone who belongs at a school fundraiser, not a federal indictment. I'm aware, then you're aware you need a wife." Viktor was quiet for a long time. "Not a girlfriend," Dominic continued. "Not a date to the gala. A wife. Someone who lives in that penthouse, who shows up at the right dinners, who smiles at the right cameras for the next 4 months until this case is dismissed." "And where exactly am I supposed to find a woman willing to do that?" "I already found her." Sophie Marchand was elbow-deep in a sink full of cold dishwater when her phone rang. She ignored it. The Tuesday lunch rush at Harbour Street Grill had left the kitchen in a disaster, and she was the only one who'd stayed to help the sous chef break it down. Because that was the kind of person Sophie was, the kind who stayed. She was 26 years old, 5'4", 263 pounds on a good day, and currently wearing a grease-stained apron with someone else's name on it. Her dark hair was piled on top of her head with a pencil through it. She had a philosophy degree she'd never used, and a student loan she was very much using, in the sense that it was slowly using her. Her phone rang again. She peeled off one rubber glove and answered, "Mrs. Marchand." A man's voice. Very smooth, very expensive. "My name is Dominic Firth. I'm a lawyer with Firth & Associates. I'm reaching out on behalf of a client who is looking for a personal arrangement, paid, fully legal, fully documented, and your name was referred to us." Sophie blinked at a grease spot on the wall. "My name was referred to you for what, exactly?" "A temporary marriage. 4 months. You'd be compensated $250,000, with a signing bonus of $25,000 upon agreement. You'd be required to live at the client's residence, attend public events, and maintain the appearance of a genuine relationship." Sophie stood completely still. "You still there?" Dominic asked. "I'm here." She pulled out the pencil and her hair fell down. "I'm just who referred me. A mutual acquaintance who felt you were trustworthy, discreet, and in a position where this arrangement might appeal." In a position, that was one way to put it. She'd been 2 months behind on rent since January. Her mother's physiotherapy bills had started coming in December. Sophie had been picking up extra shifts since November and still couldn't get ahead of it. "I'd want to see the contract first," she said. "Everything in writing, every single thing." "Of course. And I want a lawyer of my own to review it." A brief pause. "That can be arranged." She looked down at the cold dishwater. "Okay," Sophie said. "Set up the meeting." She'd expected an office. What she got was a penthouse elevator that required a key card, a set of doors that opened without her knocking, and Viktor Carrera standing in a living room that was larger than the entire floor of her apartment building. He was not what she'd pictured. She'd been told he was in his late 30s. He was 38, and he looked like someone had carved him out of something difficult. Jaw like a ledge, dark eyes that moved across her once and gave nothing back. He wore a grey shirt, no tie, sleeves folded to the elbow. There were tattoos along his forearms that disappeared under the fabric. He was in the way of men who'd gotten used to being the most dangerous thing in any room. Completely still. He looked at her like she was a file he was reviewing. Sophie held his gaze and did not look away, because she'd learned a long time ago that looking away first cost you something you didn't get back. "Mrs. March," he said. "Mr. Carrera." He gestured at the chair across from him. She sat. He sat. Dominic laid the contract on the coffee table between them. "You read it?" Viktor asked. "Twice. My cousin reviewed it. She's a paralegal." Something shifted in his expression, not quite interest, but something adjacent. "And the morality clause on page 7 is vague. I want it defined more specifically, and I want the exit conditions for both parties clarified in the event of a mutual agreement to terminate early." Viktor looked at Dominic, who made a small note. "Fine," Viktor said. "Anything else? I have questions about the public appearances. You said 3 to 4 per month. I need to know the nature of those events in advance. I'm not going to show up somewhere and be blindsided. Reasonable, and I keep my job at the restaurant." He paused. "Why? Because I've worked there for 3 years, and I'm not disappearing from my life for 4 months. I'll attend your events. I'll be present at your residence. But I have a life outside this." Viktor studied her for a moment, the kind of moment that some men used to make you feel small, to make you reconsider, to make you aware of the imbalance of power in the room. Sophie waited. "Fine," he said again. And that was that. She signed the contract that evening. He shook her hand once briefly, and then his phone rang, and he turned away, and she was shown to a guest room by a housekeeper named Margaret, who seemed to find nothing about the situation unusual whatsoever. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed in a room larger than her apartment and thought, "This is either the smartest thing you've ever done or the stupidest." She genuinely wasn't sure which. The first 3 weeks were a careful, silent negotiation of space. Viktor kept hours that made no sense. Gone before dawn, back after midnight, sometimes not at all. When he was home, he was on the phone or in his office with the door closed or eating standing at the kitchen island, reading documents that he turned face down when she walked in. Sophie stayed out of his way. She'd agreed to a performance, not a relationship. She went to work. She came home. She cooked dinner sometimes because she liked cooking, and the kitchen was extraordinary. She left his portion in the fridge without comment. He ate it, always. She noticed because she noticed things. The first event was a fundraiser for a children's hospital. She wore a deep blue wrap dress she'd found at a consignment shop on Barrington Street, and felt the moment the elevator doors opened and a room full of people in couture turned to look. She knew how to read a room. She'd been reading rooms like this her whole life, the slight recalibration in people's eyes when they looked at her, the tiny adjustment of expectations. Viktor appeared at her elbow. She hadn't heard him move. "You look uncomfortable," he said very quietly. "I look fine," she said. "I know. I said you look uncomfortable, that's different." He held out his arm. "It'll be easier if you take it." She took it. He guided her through the room with the ease of someone who'd been doing this since before she was born. He introduced her as his wife without hesitation or qualification. He kept one hand at the small of her back during conversations, not possessively, but steadily, like an anchor. At one point, a woman in emerald silk asked Sophie what she did, with the very specific tone that meant she was asking Sophie to justify her presence. Sophie smiled. "I'm a food service professional," she said, "and I'm working on a novel." She wasn't working on a novel. She'd never thought about working on a novel in her life. But the woman nodded as though that was perfectly reasonable and turned to Viktor to ask about the harbour development project. And Sophie thought that felt good. "You're better at this than I expected." "What did you expect?" He considered. "Someone nervous. I've been dealing with rooms full of people who underestimate me since I was 12, she said. "I've had a lot of practice." He looked at her then, briefly, in the dark of the car. He didn't say anything. But something changed, some small, quiet thing. She felt it, and filed it away under things she would not examine too closely. There was a man named Rémi Delacroix who operated out of Montreal and who had decided some time ago that Viktor Carrera's territory along the Atlantic corridor belonged to him by right of appetite. Rémy was the kind of man who mistook being feared by weaker people for being powerful. He had money, and he had men, and he had, recently, a plan. Viktor knew about the plan. He'd known for 6 weeks. He was handling it. What he had not accounted for was that Rémy's people had been watching the penthouse. Had been watching Sophie. It was a Wednesday. Sophie was working a lunch shift. She left at 4, took the bus because the weather was good, and stopped at the market on Quinpool to pick up lemons and fresh dill, because she'd been thinking about a salmon dish since Tuesday. She never made it to the second stall. She was aware of a van pulling to the curb beside her. She was aware, in the half-second before the door opened, that something was very wrong. She turned to run and was grabbed before she completed the turn. 2 men, fast and practiced, and she fought because that was her instinct. Twisting hard and landing one elbow into someone's ribs and hearing a satisfying grunt. But there were 2 of them and 1 of her, and they were in the van. And the door was closed before anyone on the street had properly registered what they'd seen. One of the men pressed something against her wrist and muttered in French. The other was on his phone. Sophie controlled her breathing. She looked at the van's interior, a water bottle rolling near the wheel well. A phone charger. She was cataloguing, because if she catalogued she wouldn't panic, and if she didn't panic she could think. She thought about Viktor. The call came to Viktor's private line at 4:23 p.m. He was in the middle of a meeting with 3 men who'd come down from Cape Breton specifically to discuss territory. He looked at the screen, an unknown number. Normally he let those go. Something made him answer. "Your wife is with us." Rémy Delacroix himself. Viktor recognized the voice, that particular, self-satisfied lilt of a man who'd just done something he thought was clever. "We'd like to discuss the Port of Halifax shipping contracts. Perhaps this provides some additional motivation for the conversation." The room had gone very quiet. There was a silence on his end that Rémy probably mistook for hesitation. It wasn't hesitation. Viktor stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He said to no one in particular, to all of them, "Reschedule this, Viktor." Rémy started. "You have made," Viktor said, very carefully, very quietly, in the specific register of voice he reserved for situations that had already passed the point of no return, "a significant error in judgment. I want you to sit with that while I come find you." He hung up. He called his head of security, a man named Claude Arsenault, who'd been with him since they were both 20 years old, and who picked up on the first ring. "I need the Delacroix warehouse locations, all of them, and I need Sophie found in the next 30 minutes. "Already on it," Claude said. "We had a tail on her we hadn't told you about. Lost contact 12 minutes ago. Last position, Quinpool and Oxford. We're pulling footage now." Viktor was already in the elevator. They were in a warehouse on the east side, near the container port. She'd tracked their direction based on the turns, counting seconds. When they opened the van door and pulled her out, she got her first look at the space, high ceilings, bad lighting, smell of salt and diesel, 3 other men waiting. They zip-tied her wrists to a metal chair. Which was, honestly, a little dramatic. She said nothing. She watched. There was a man at the far end who had the posture of someone in charge. Not physically large, expensive jacket. The kind of manicure that people got when they wanted to signal they didn't do their own dirty work. He was on the phone. He came over eventually, crouched down to her eye level in a way that was meant to feel patronizing. "You understand what you're for," he said, in accented English. "I understand what you think I'm for," Sophie said. "Those are different things." His eyes moved over her slowly and deliberately, in the way some men looked at women they wanted to make feel less than. "Relax, chérie," he said. "Viktor is a practical man. He'll come to an agreement." "You don't know Viktor very well," she said. He smiled and walked away. She started working her wrists against the zip tie. It was plastic. The chair arm had a slight rough edge where the weld wasn't clean. It was going to take time, but she had that. She thought about the salmon dish. She thought about the lemons she'd left in the market. She kept working her wrists. Viktor hit the first warehouse at 6:10 p.m. with 8 men, and a certainty that had no room in it for doubt or hesitation. The first 2 men they encountered at the loading dock made the mistake of raising their weapons and were relieved of that problem within approximately 4 seconds. Viktor walked through the door. The warehouse was not the right one. The footage had given them 3 possibles. He was already moving toward his vehicle when Claude said in his earpiece, "Got her." Container facility on Barrington Extension. Black Rover just confirmed. How many inside? Thermal, says Sindhakar. He did something then that he had not done in a very long time. He moved fast. Not tactically fast, not professionally fast. Fast in the way of someone who cannot tolerate the gap between where they are and where they need to be. He would think about that later. She'd gotten through the zip tie when she heard the first sound from outside. A thud, muffled, and then another. The man in the expensive jacket had gone very still near the far wall. 2 of the others reached for weapons. One of them moved toward her. She stood up from the chair. He stopped, surprised, because he hadn't expected her to be standing. "Sit back down." He said no. Sophie said. The side door came off its hinges. Viktor moved through the warehouse with the focused, unhurried precision of someone who'd already decided how this ended. He was not loud about it. He didn't need to be. The man who'd been reaching towards Sophie changed his mind immediately and completely. Remy Delacroix, for the first time in what was probably a long career, made a sound that was extremely undignified. Viktor was across the room in 4 strides. He looked at Sophie, at the raw marks on her wrists, at the cheap plastic chair, at her hair falling loose around her face, and something in his expression did something she'd never seen it do before. It cracked, just slightly, along some internal fault line that he probably wasn't aware of. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "I got out of the tie myself." She paused. His eyes moved to her wrists again. Back to her face. He turned around. What happened next, Sophie would later describe privately as extremely thorough. Viktor walked directly to Remy Delacroix, took him by the collar of his expensive jacket, and spoke to him in a voice so quiet and so cold and so absolutely certain that every other person in that warehouse took a physical step backward. She couldn't hear all of it. She caught enough. Territory. Every associate, every shipment, every account. You have 72 hours to vacate. Not negotiate. Vacate. Remy Delacroix, to his credit, appeared to finally understand what kind of man Viktor Carrera actually was. Viktor released him. He turned back to Sophie. "Let's go," he said. Claude was holding the car door open. Viktor put his hand on her back as she got in, not the careful, curated gesture from the fundraiser, not a performance for any audience. Just his hand, warm and immediate between her shoulder blades. She noticed. He didn't take her to the penthouse right away. He took her to a private clinic on Roby Street where a doctor who asked no questions examined her wrists, confirmed no ligament damage, bandaged them neatly. Viktor stood in the corner of the room with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watching the process with an intensity that was not particularly clinical. On the drive back, she said, "You're angry." "Yes, at me." He looked at her. "No, at yourself," a pause longer than she expected. "I should have had better coverage on you," he said. "That's on me. You had coverage on me." She processed this. "You were having me followed. I was having you protected. There's a difference." She thought about arguing the point. She decided against it. "I got out of the tie myself," she said again, because for some reason it mattered to her that he knew. "I know." Claude saw the footage, and he looked out the window. "And you didn't panic. You assessed and you acted. Is that why you look?" She searched for the word disturbed. Another pause. Longer still. "You weren't supposed to be in that situation at all." They didn't speak again until they were back in the penthouse. Margaret had left tea on the counter. somehow aware in the way that Margaret was always somehow aware. Sophie sat at the kitchen island and wrapped both hands around the mug. The city lights were doing what they always did, spreading gold and white across the harbor water. Viktor stood on the other side of the island. He was still in his jacket, which had, she now noticed, a small amount of someone else's blood on the cuff. Why did they think it would work, she asked. Taking me. He was quiet. Because, he said carefully, men like Remy Delacroix look at a situation and make an assessment. They assessed that you were leverage, and were they right? She watched his face. He said, "What do you think?" Sophie thought about the way he'd come through that door, the way he'd moved across that warehouse, the sound of his voice when he'd spoken to Remy Delacroix. Not rage, something colder than rage, something that came from a place that didn't negotiate. She thought about his hand between her shoulder blades. "I think," she said slowly, "that they made a significant error in judgment." Something moved across his face. He reached up and loosened the button at his collar, which was the most undone she'd ever seen him in 3 weeks of living in the same space. "Go to sleep," he said. "You've had a long day." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." "That was never in question," Viktor said, and he said it the way he said all his most important things, quietly, without inflection, like it was simply a fact about the world that required no decoration. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about that sentence for a long time. He brought her coffee the next morning, which had never happened before. He set it on the counter without comment and was reading something on his phone. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't let herself, and thought about all the things she'd been very carefully not examining for 3 weeks. She poured cream into the coffee. She said, "The contract." He looked up. 4 months, she said. "That's what we agreed on." "Yes, it's been 3 weeks. He put his phone down. He gave her his full attention, which was a particular thing. Viktor's full attention, when he chose to give it, had a weight to it. "What are you saying?" he asked. Sophie looked at her coffee. She looked at him. She was 26 years old, and she had made a practical decision for practical reasons, and at no point in the planning of that decision had she accounted for this. For him, specifically, for the version of him she'd seen in that warehouse and in the car and standing in a clinic at 8 p.m. on a Wednesday night watching a doctor bandage her wrists like someone had done something to him personally. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "I'm saying I notice things, that's all." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she'd almost decided to take her coffee and go back to her room. "I've been running this organization since I was 24, he said. "I've built it, protected it. I've made a very specific kind of life." He paused. "It doesn't have a lot of room in it." "I know," Sophie said, "and yet." "And yet," she agreed. He picked his phone back up, but he didn't look at it. He set it back down. "Stay for dinner," he said. "Not a performance, not an event, just dinner," Sophie thought. About the salmon, the lemons she'd had to leave at the market. "I'll need to stop at the grocery store," she said. The weeks that followed were different. He came home at reasonable hours more often. He didn't always go to his office when she was in the living room. He asked, once, what she was reading, and she told him it was a book about the history of organized labor in Cape Breton, which made him make a face she'd never seen before, an expression that turned out, after a moment, to be genuine amusement. She made him cook something exactly once. It was catastrophic. She'd stood in the kitchen laughing until she couldn't breathe, and he'd stood there with burnt garlic on a spoon looking at her with an expression she didn't have words for. She caught him looking at her sometimes, when she was on the phone or reading or doing nothing in particular. He didn't look away fast when she caught him. He just looked. At a dinner for the Halifax Business Association, a man named Gerald Fairborn, whose hair suggested the 1980s had never fully released him. Made a comment about Sophie's plate that was wrapped in the particular tissue paper of jokes that are not jokes. Something about appetite, Viktor said, without looking up from his own plate, in a voice that made Gerald Fairborn's smile die on his faces. Careful, Gerald. I have a long memory and a short patience for certain kinds of comments, especially about my wife. Sophie looked at the side of his face. My wife, not Sophie, not Miss Marchand, not the woman I've arranged to have present. My wife, in a tone that was not for the room, was not for the cameras or Dominic's strategy, was not for the Delacroix case or the federal court date, or any of it. She pressed her ankle gently against his under the table. He pressed back. The Delacroix case was dismissed 6 weeks early. Insufficient evidence, procedural issues, a string of circumstances that Dominic described as fortunate, and that Sophie had enough sense not to inquire about too deeply. It meant the 4 months were up. She was sitting in the kitchen on a Thursday evening, not cooking, not reading, just sitting with both hands around a mug when he came in. He didn't say anything at first. Didn't say inform her. He poured himself a glass of water. He stood at the window, looking at the harbor, which was what he did when he was thinking something through. The contract terms have been fulfilled, he said. Yes, Dominic has the termination paperwork ready. I know. He emailed me. Viktor turned from the window. I haven't signed it, Sophie said. He went very still. I've been thinking about what you said, she continued. About the life you've built and the room it has. Or doesn't have. She looked at him. But you've been making room. I've watched you do it. So either you're very committed to the performance even when no one's watching, or... He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed her, which stopped the sentence very effectively. When he pulled back, he looked at her in a way that was uncomfortable to receive, not in a bad way, just in the way of something very direct and very real, with no space between it and you. I'm not interested in the termination paperwork, he said. No, Sophie said. Me neither. He went to the drawer near the refrigerator where he'd put his copy of the contract 4 months ago. He pulled it out. He took it to the kitchen island and looked at it for a moment. All the terms and clauses and exit conditions she'd negotiated one Thursday evening in this same room. He tore it down the middle, then again. Then he dropped it in the recycling bin, which was perhaps less dramatic than burning it, but more practical, and Viktor was, at his core, a practical man. Sophie looked at the recycling bin. She looked at him. The salmon, she said. I've been meaning to make you that salmon dish for 2 months. Make it, he said. She made it. He sat on the counter while she cooked, which she'd never seen him do, and it turned out that when Viktor Carrera wasn't performing anything for anyone, he was actually extremely good company, dry, and occasionally funny and full of opinions about things she'd never have guessed he cared about, like the correct way to fillet a fish, and the particular inadequacy of Halifax winters, and whether there was any good reason to watch the 3rd act of any opera ever written. They ate it at the kitchen island. He had 2 servings. She took that as the highest possible compliment. Afterwards, she stood at the sink rinsing plates, and became aware that he was just standing there, close, not doing anything. Viktor, there's something I need to tell you. He waited. He was good at waiting. She turned around, looked at him. I have a doctor's appointment next week, she said. I was going to go by myself because I wasn't. I didn't know what we were, or what this was, but I think I should tell you. She paused. I think I'm pregnant. Viktor Carrera, who had faced down federal investigations and organized crime and a warehouse full of Remy Delacroix's men with complete composure, stood completely still in the middle of his kitchen, in the particular way of someone whose internal architecture has just shifted on its foundation. Then he said, How long have you known? A week. I bought a test. I haven't. I wanted to be sure before I said anything. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not carefully, just took it, the way you take something that belongs with you. Next week, he said. I'll come with you. Sophie looked at his hand around hers. She looked at his face, at this man who had built a life out of hard angles and controlled spaces and careful distances, who had come through a warehouse door and torn a contract in half and sat on her kitchen counter arguing about opera. "Okay," she said. Outside, the harbor was doing its usual thing, gold and black and endlessly patient, and the city of Halifax was going about its evening in complete ignorance of the fact that something had started, quietly and without announcement, in a kitchen on the 32nd floor, which was, Sophie thought, exactly how the best things usually did.